Okay, I want to welcome everybody to Thursday's Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for this Thursday, May 19th. Our circumstance is an interesting one, and I'll reference the fact that today happens to be the birthday of Minister Malcolm X, who would have been 97 years old today. And there's a reason to cite that, which will become a bit more evident as we go into what we have to talk about. Helga Zepp-LaRouche did a webcast today, and after doing a kind of thorough review of the escalation of the drive for war, stated that she believes that this is the most dangerous moment in human history. Now that's one of these things that it would be well to contest in order to arrive at the sober assessment that is actually true. Because that's the kind of thing that someone might say, and any of us, because we aren't listening, would decide to not take seriously. Either we will say it's hyperbole, or we'll say it's merely an opinion, or that it's an emotional statement. But the question would be, the more frightening question is, what if it's actually true? And what if the fact that it's actually true would mean that you would have to change virtually everything in your life to deal with that as a reality if you actually believed it? So this is a significant question to take up. And one of the things that she did in her webcast was to call on those that view it, and we would urge that you all do that, to actually study the real causes for what it is that we're actually confronted with. For the purposes of diversion, many people want to think a lot of other things are a lot more important. Drug traffic is important. Roe v. Wade is important. Your stand on viruses may be important, or your stand for or against Russia or Ukraine. But really, there's something else that is suggested, I would contend, by stating that this would be the most dangerous moment in all of human history. You could say that is because of the weapons of mass destruction that exist, but those weapons of mass destruction existed in 1962, and certainly the world was confronted by something that probably, if you ask most Americans, if they were either alive at the time or even, let's say, are acquainted with it, they would say, well, that moment was more dangerous than now, and because we knew that the President of the United States had stated in a public address that he considered any motion by the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles in Cuba would be considered as an attack on the United States. It was not known by the American population and was only sort of dimly hypothesized by the American administration. But in fact, nuclear weapons were already on the island of Cuba. And so if you were to ask most people, and certainly people in the Democratic Party and certainly in the administrations of government, Republican or Democratic, they would say to you, well, that was way, way more dangerous than what we're in now. But what if they're wrong? What if they're wrong, and actually we had to consider this, because I think anyone who was reasonably old enough to remember that moment knows that people did all sorts of things at that moment in October, the 13 days of that October, when they thought the world was going to come to an end. And so your question would be, well, are people doing anything like that now? So the first thing to recognize is that that statement that she made is either not accepted by people or is not apparently understood or known. But, well, that would, of course, make it the most dangerous moment in history right away if it were the case that we were actually poised in the same circumstance, perhaps actually a worse circumstance than the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in one respect, you already know it's worse because at least now we know from archive records and so on, that President John Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, then the Attorney General, were conducting back-channel negotiations and discussions with Nikita Khrushchev, who was, as the Kennedys were, in opposition or in contention with members of his military. And as a result of those back-channel negotiations, one or two occasions during those 13 days when things could have gotten very, very out of control were averted. We also know that that one of the brothers was dead 1 year later, and the other brother was dead 5 years later. And while many may have differences as to what they think about the assassinations of both, there are two things that can't be denied. Both were assassinated, and both played the role they played in preventing nuclear war at that time. So let's engage an hypothesis for a minute. Not that you have to believe this, but let's ask this question. Was it the case that in October of 1962 that there were adventurers among the military in the United States that in fact wanted to risk thermonuclear war with Russia because they were convinced that the Russians would blink and that the Russians did not have the power, or rather did not have power, did not have the will to go to war? Now, the answer is that there were several people that Kennedy was contending with, most famously General Curtis LeMay, but there were others. Now, ask yourself this question. In an era where people are talking about cyber war, and they're talking about prompt global strike, and they're talking about the ability to do things at the borders of not now the Soviet Union, which after all had buffer zones. I mean, that's why they had those countries. That was the whole reason that the Warsaw Pact really existed. It was to make sure that at least 1,000 miles from Russia's border, Stalin wanted to make sure he had a buffer. And in that circumstance, in 1962, with all those nations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and so forth, all incorporated into a sort of a near abroad, as we would call it, a Russian border in which, by the way, they had hundreds of thousands of troops in Eastern Europe. In that circumstance, we risked, or we're risking, a form of thermonuclear war. So you look at now, and you ask yourself the question, is now less dangerous than then? Now then ask yourself, well, where are the back channel negotiations? They don't exist. Then ask yourself about the qualifications of the leadership in the transatlantic sector. Ask yourself this question: how many of the people who are serving as leaders in those nations were veterans? Well, clearly not of the Second World War, because they would be very, very old, but of any of the subsequent wars, Vietnam, Korea, even Iraq. How many of the present leaders were, in fact, either draft dodgers or war avoiders as adults? How many of the others have any inkling of any understanding of what thermonuclear warfare actually means? So the first thing to understand is that actually probably, and this is not an indictment of anyone, but it's probably the case that you are living in a fantasy world tonight in which you are operating with the presumption that, things may be bad, and we may be talking about some kind of conflict in Ukraine, but we're certainly not talking about risking the annihilation of the planet. No one would do that. So the first thing to understand here is that as we bring up this question, let's understand what kind of leadership the United States has had recently. Let's take the recent outburst by George W. Bush. I think some of you have heard this. People have had a sort of a sick laugh about it. So let me simply take this, and then we will turn it over to Mike and his briefing. Bush said this in a speech. In contrast, Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. Of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Okay, that's an exact quote from what he said. We may hear that one way, but how is that heard in Russia? How's that heard in China? Or how, for that matter, is that heard in a country like India? So as we go into the briefing tonight, we are not suggesting that we don't have a solution or that our organization has not been putting forward a solution, nor are we suggesting that that solution cannot be eminently implemented. But it absolutely can't be implemented by people that refuse to understand why this would be the most dangerous moment in all world history. If we cannot establish that understanding, then it's very difficult for us to implement the solution to the actual problem, because the problem is not faced. So the only people that can be optimistic in the world are those that are capable of facing the world. And so what we want to do now is give a briefing, a general sense of what it is that we know, what it is our organization is up to, and what we'd like you to help in, participate in, or you may already be doing that, but at least to update you as to how and why we think our actions now are capable of not only averting this circumstance, but reversing the whole trajectory that this circumstance implies. So, Mike, if you're there, you now have the floor.
Okay. You hear me okay?
Yes, your volume's very good.
Okay. All right, good evening. This is quite a moment in history, a moment in which virtually everybody is somewhat surprised, but nonetheless, virtually everybody recognizes that something has gone horribly wrong. There's a justifiable fear around the world that we're on the brink of a war that could be nuclear. There's a very clear recognition that the economic system in the Western world has gone completely berserk, a hyperinflationary breakdown crisis. But let me start by just making it very clear that we are in war. I mean, our country is at war with Russia and implicitly also with China already. Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, just yesterday said, we have referred to those who are imposing these vile sanctions and then pumping weapons into Ukraine as unfriendly nations. But let's be honest, these are hostile states. This is a quote, hostile states, because what they are doing is war. And indeed, it is war. The sanctions we've imposed on Russia are incredibly illegal under any semblance of international law as we understood it with the founding of the United Nations and the international laws submitted at that time. Absolutely illegal. The proxy war that we're fighting with Russia in Ukraine as co-belligerents. They don't even want to admit they're co-belligerents. Congressman Thomas Massey has even put a bill up to say, look, at least admit that we're co-belligerents, i.e. that we're at war with Russia in Ukraine. But in fact, those those people, the war party, from both political parties, are openly acting as if we are, in fact, at war, and we are. Steny Hoyer, the majority leader in the House of Representatives for the Democrats, in a speech on the floor of the Congress, said, "We're at war. Why are we attacking our president? We're at war." And Massey responded to that, "Wait a minute, who is he to declare war? Our Constitution, Article 1, makes it very clear that the power to declare war rests in the Congress, not in the president, and certainly not in a member of the House of Representatives. And yet this is the reality. They're, in a certain sense, acknowledging the reality is that we are illegally, under our own law, illegally at war. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, went to Kiev and told Zelensky, "There shall be no negotiations. Putin is a war criminal, and you do not negotiate with war criminals." So this, I mean, I don't think I have to tell anybody in this call. This is ignoring the fact that the driving force of the Ukrainian military is the Azov Brigade, the Nazis, proud Nazis, who wear the swastika and the Sudenrat as their symbol, the same symbol that was used by this deranged teenage killer in Buffalo the other day, who follows and admires, as Dennis Speed said in a meeting the other day. He said, if this deranged kid, this obviously insane child, were to do exactly the same thing in Ukraine, we'd be heralding him as a great hero in our major newspapers. While our congressmen all vote to send $40 billion to Ukraine, much of which will likely go to the Nazis. And keep in mind that the $40 billion that the Congress voted today, finally approved, is larger than the entire Russian defense budget. So keep that in mind. So let's look back. Let's look back to where the original Nazis came from. In the 1920s and 30s, there was the mobilization of various forces in Germany responding to the hideous imposition that had been imposed on Germany after World War I, where they were basically imposed with massive reparations, which destroyed any chance of their economic recovery from the war, and led to, fostered the kind of radical institutions. The head of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England, openly sponsored the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. He was a close personal friend of Hitler's economic minister, the Reichsminister, Jean-Marc Schacht, who became the economics minister under Hitler, who implemented the Nazi policy of giving all economic power to the banks themselves and diverting credit from anything other than the buildup of the military forces to prepare for the Anschluss and for the Barbarossa and for what became the Second World War. They were so close, Montague Norman and Jean-Marc Schacht, that Schacht's children had as their godfather Montague Norman, head of the Bank of England. He was passing gold to the Nazis even after the war began. So why did they give rise to the Nazis? Well, you could say a lot of things. You could say they basically agreed with the Malthusian idea that certain lesser races should be exterminated. Maybe they didn't say it was the Jews. Maybe they said it was the blacks or the Indians. Because keep in mind, the British believed emphatically, publicly, openly in eugenics, race science, that there were lesser races and superior races. And guess who the superior race was? So maybe that was why. But in geopolitical terms, they were anxious to see Germany and Russia destroy each other. This was the geopolitics of Mackinder and Haushofer and the people who knew that you did not want to allow any force on the east or west to control the heartland, so that the British Empire, which was based on the financial institutions controlling world trade and finances, could continue their looting and genocidal policies against the colonies around the world. So they supported Hitler, put him in power. Now, look at what's happening today. The West, just like in the 1930s, when there was this was the Great Depression. Remember, the Bank of England was in dire trouble. The Reichsbank was collapsing. So their solution was, among other things, to start financing a war. And look, what do we have today? The whole Western financial system is in a state of absolute decay and collapse. This is after 30 years, 40 years, but especially since 2008. The massive money printing to bail out the banks rather than putting them through bankruptcy proceeding, as Lyndon LaRouche said they had to do. They didn't want to do that, so they didn't have bankruptcy reorganization. They just printed the money and the trillions of dollars. There's now $2 quadrillion in outstanding debt. A quadrillion is 1,000 trillion. It's very hard to wrap your mind around that figure. But there's about $2 quadrillion in debt, mostly worthless gambling debts, derivatives of various sorts. That's sitting on top of of what's left of the real economy in the Western world. It could not be paid. There's no way to pay it. If you shut down all investments into anything in the world other than bailing out the banks, it would even scratch the surface of $2 quadrillion. So what is maintaining their power, their myth that they can still act as if they're the gods of Olympus who can simply declare that we say you must do such and such, you must obey like the gods of Olympus. Well, it's this idea that we're the only superpower simply is not true anymore. And they know it. They know that China has emerged. China has become what is probably already the largest economy in the world. They have linked up with Russia. They're collaborating on the Belt and Road idea. China proved internally that the American system of Hamiltonian economics, of directing credit from the federal government into the infrastructure needed to lift the platform of the production, worked. Justin Yifu Lin, who is perhaps China's leading economist, whom I interviewed a few months ago, who was interviewed by Harley Schlanger, who also spoke at our April 9th conference. He said in the interview, how did China escape from being one of the worst, most impoverished nations in the world into probably the most productive, most advanced rate of development and one of the greatest infrastructures in the history of mankind, and lift 700 or 800 million people out of poverty for the first time in humanity, in the history of humanity? We did it with Hamiltonian economics. This is what Justin Lin told us. Now, this was the man who was the chief economist at the World Bank from 2008 to 2012, highly respected in the Western world, ran basically the economic side of the World Bank. He was senior vice president at the World Bank. And what did he learn in those 4 years? Well, he told us what he learned. He learned that the World Bank and the IMF were not in the least bit interested in developing infrastructure anyway. This wasn't appropriate for the wogs, for the lesser races, some might say, more overtly. At their level of development, we shouldn't be doing boondoggles like railroads and ports and power plants. That we'll help them with their health and education, and we'll help the small farmer with a 1 hectare farm. We'll help him get his crop to market because we're benevolent. We believe in helping people. But for God's sake, let's not waste money on boondoggles like infrastructure. And Justin Lin realized that was the policy of the Western financial institutions, and he went back to China and became a lead economist there, working on the Belt and Road to do quite the opposite, to build infrastructure, because they had long since learned, as the old Chinese saying says, if you want to be rich, you first build a road. Infrastructure is the basis on which you lift the productive platform for every person in your nation, and you break through the boundaries that prevent industrialization and modernization. So this is what is hated. This is what is despised by the City of London and Wall Street and the neocons and the military-industrial complex. Heaven forbid that Russia and China should come together and undermine our control of the third world, make it impossible. Is somebody? Oh no, I'm sorry. That's my own computer. Excuse me. This is the way. This is why the Western oligarchs, those who unfortunately rule in the UK and the US, and their satraps in Europe who faithfully obey their demands from London and New York. This is what, in fact, is leading them to the decision that since they cannot repair their own system, there's no solution. They can't raise interest rates or lower interest rates or pump more money in. It's out of control. The hyperinflation is there. It's going to continue. The markets are going to collapse. There's going to be a hyperinflationary destruction of currencies one way or the other. And therefore, we in our wisdom as the gods of Olympus will simply have to destroy any alternative that would undermine our being the only world superpower. Therefore, we're going to have to go to war, but we'll force them to back down. China and Russia are smart enough that they're not going to stand up to our demands. So where did this come from? Well, it really started a long, long time ago. I first met Lyndon LaRouche in 1971. This was the year that Nixon took the dollar off of gold. And I went to a conference in New York and heard this genius, Lyndon LaRouche, who'd become relatively famous overnight when he, being the only economist who'd warned that the dollar as good as gold was about to collapse for various reasons. And he warned this was going to happen. And when it did, people turned around to say, how did you know? So at that conference, LaRouche said, this is the end of the American system. It's going to mean that instead of the Hamiltonian system that Roosevelt helped preserve, of directing credit into infrastructure, building transportation, power, water, schools and hospitals, policies that made America do in the 1930s the greatest infrastructure boon that's ever been seen in history, just like China has done in the last 30 years. But at that time, that was the greatest boon. How did he do it? He did it by directing credit, American system, Hamiltonian economics, directing credit into those things needed for the general welfare by lifting the platform of production. And Lynn said, that's fine, that's gone. Now it's going to increasingly be British system. Banks rule the world. They invest where they can get the quickest buck, the short-term profit, not long-term investments that produce productivity, but short-term profits for the financial oligarchs. And this would lead to depression, it would lead to hyperinflation, it would lead to pandemics, it will lead to wars, and eventually a war with Russia, he said. And he said very few people are going to want to listen to me, my warning, because they'll not, if they believed it, they would have to take responsibility for the human race. As Dennis was saying earlier, if they believe it, they can't continue living the way they are, ignoring what's being done in their name by their governments. They would have to do something. So they won't want to listen. We'll only recruit one or two people here and there. But when it happens, then there's going to be a shock, and people will look back to see who's been telling the truth and who's been lying. And this is what's happening today around the world. There's an upsurge of people responding to our petition, the petition for a new security and development architecture. The conference we had on April 9th with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., with Justin Lin, the leading Chinese economist, with government cabinet officials from India, from South Africa, showing that you can build a world alliance to stop this descent into a new dark age, this threat of nuclear war. Effectively, we are in that moment that Lynn forecast at that time. And this is a moment where our having stood up for the truth, although it wasn't always all that convenient for us, as many of us know who spent some time on sabbatical leave under the auspices of the states or the federal government and their penal institutions. But nonetheless, we stuck our ground. We told the truth, and now people can look back and see that indeed we did, and what we warned was right, and that now they're facing that question. Am I going to be a human being and respond as a human being whose creative powers must be put to work to prevent the destruction of this incredible human race that is now threatened with thermonuclear war, annihilation perhaps of the human race? Or will I just say, well, it's too big. I can't be part of that. I'll just go along with the war party. Now, this is global. This is not just Ukraine and Russia. We're already at war with China. Now, if you agree that the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia are acts of war, as you must, then the sanctions we've already imposed on China are also acts of war. And whatever excuses they use about human rights and so forth has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with what I said. They cannot allow this policy of lifting the third world out from under their control through policies that they've long since deserted and which they will not go back to because it would mean giving up their power. So what's happening in Asia? We did an interview with Chaz Freeman, one of the leading China scholars who was an ambassador to Saudi Arabia and also the deputy in China, and he was Nixon's translator actually back in 1971. He speaks fluent Chinese when Nixon went to China. He's now a very outspoken proponent of ending this insane confrontation, military confrontation with China and with Russia, but especially with China. He said in the interview with EIR, with me, that we've already broken every pledge we gave to the Chinese in the 1970s when we switched our recognition from Taiwan to Beijing. I won't go through them now, but we broke every one of them. And what are we planning for Taiwan? This is really a replay of what we've done with Ukraine. Ukraine was pumped up with military power. We supported the most extreme right-wing forces. In the case, they are outright Nazis, starting with the coup we financed and ran in 2014, which put Nazi and Nazi-linked powers in force. Well, we have continued pumping Taiwan full of weapons, and we will likely improve it, increase it rather, and demonize China the way we demonize Putin, right? Why? Because we want to induce China to do what they've pledged they will do, and they will, if Taiwan were to actually declare independence, since both sides supposedly agree that Taiwan is a province of China. There's a disagreement about who runs it, but there's one China, two systems policy, which could lead eventually to cooperation and a peaceful reunification. But what we're doing is the opposite. We're fostering those forces within China that are the most extreme right wing. And keep in mind that after the revolution in China, after the Communist Party took over and declared the People's Republic of China, and the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, they induced Chiang Kai-shek to become the centerpiece for what they called the World Anti-Communist League, the WACL, the World Anti-Communist League. So Chiang Kai-shek played that role on behalf of the emerging sort of neoconservative forces in the U.S., the oligarchy in the U.K. and the U.S. This included the former Nazis in the occupied countries in Europe that the Russians had occupied at the end of World War II, those who had supported Hitler, like Stepan Bandera and the Azov Brigade people who praised the Nazis from that era. There are those who, an extreme right in Taiwan, who would do the same thing and who would basically say we should just go ahead and declare independence. Now, if that happens and if they induce another proxy war where they impose even worse sanctions on China like they did on Russia, throw them out of SWIFT and so forth, thinking that somehow they can force them to break down, that is certainly the game plan. Now, there was there's a former ambassador from Australia, John Lander is his name. He was ambassador to Iran and the deputy ambassador to China. And when he left the Foreign Service, he spent a lot of time in China. He himself is also, like Chas Freeman, a leading expert on China. He did an interview with our friends in Australia, the Citizens Party. Robbie Barwick there did 2 interviews with him, actually. And what he said is very interesting. He said, I know China. I think they will not allow themselves, if at all possible, to be drawn into a war with Taiwan. And I think that the Taiwan people will not allow the extreme fanatics to allow them to basically commit suicide like the Ukraine Nazis had done. So they've got a plan B. And now this is fascinating. I'm not sure it's true. But think about the way the U.S. and the British are thinking about this. You may have seen in the newspapers that there has been some conflict in the Solomon Islands. Now, this is a place you don't hear about much. These are islands that are about 1,000 miles off of the Australian, to the northeast of Australia. In 2019, the government of the Solomon Islands switched their recognition of China from Taiwan. There's still a handful of countries that recognize Taiwan as the government of all of China. Well, they finally gave up on that and switched their recognition to Beijing. One of the big islands in the Solomon Islands, which was more under the influence of U.S. neocon regime change types, were funded to oppose this, funded by the U.S. openly, and Taiwan. And after a couple of years, this led to some demonstrations that turned into a riot last November in the major capital city, which ended up burning down a lot of Chinatown, a lot of China businesses. And they had to bring in troops from Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere to try to quell this upheaval. Well, they therefore went ahead and formed a security agreement with China earlier this year, basically saying that were there this kind of threat to the Chinese interests, that Chinese police could come in and help. Well, this is a red line, said the U.S. They sent Kurt Campbell, the National Security Council Asia expert, to the Solomon Islands just a few weeks ago, and he said, if you let the Chinese military in here, that's going to be a real change, and we're going to have to respond. So then just 2 weeks ago, the insane leadership in Australia, the Prime Minister, actually there's an election tomorrow. He may not be Prime Minister after tomorrow. But Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, said, I agree with America. The Solomon Islands are a red line. If there's any Chinese military forces that are sent into the Solomon, we're going to have, that's a red line. What's he mean? They're going to bomb them? Who knows? The Defense Secretary, just as crazy, Peter Dutton, said this is an existential threat to the Australian, to our existence, and we are preparing for war. That's a quote. We are preparing for war with China. So, John Lander, of course, ridiculed this, but he pointed out that, this is plan B for the Americans. If they can't get Taiwan to be the proxy war, they'll get Australia to be a proxy war. And just as insane. So what's going on here? Generally, the Five Eyes, the English-speaking people and their assets have gone stark raving mad. And they really believe that they can play nuclear chicken with Russia and with China, and that they're going to pursue this with no negotiations. As Boris Johnson said, as our own Blinken and company say, no negotiations. We're going to win. We're going to win. We're going to win against Russia. That's what they're saying. This is the madness. So, is it possible that they could be that crazy? Well, let me just tell you something that happened just today. 52 U.S. senators. 52. That's a majority of the U.S. Senate, 100 senators. Bipartisan. 52 senators penned a letter to President Biden yesterday, actually, which said that when he goes to Asia, he's leaving today, actually. He's going to be meeting meeting the South Korean president, the new Yoon Suk Lowell, who's the new president there. He's then going to go to Tokyo and have a meeting with the Quad. So he said when he gets there and when they do what they expect, which is to announce a new thing called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that we must include Taiwan in this new institution, this new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. All right? They say to have a free and open Indo-Pacific, we must make sure that all of America's regional allies and partners are included. The more economic engagement the U.S. and allies and partners have with Taiwan, the stronger our collective resilience against coercion. Now think of this. I mean, people generally don't know the history of our relations with China, but this is an open declaration of war, that we are willing to risk war with China just as we're willing to risk war with Russia. They are committed to this. So this is the kind of situation in which not only Americans, and we're getting floods of people calling in and contacting us because they listened to Harley Schlanger's report or because they saw our petition in Australia, in the UK, and New Zealand. And these are people who are in the heart of the beast, so to speak, in the British Empire. And they are furious, and they hear a voice of truth, a breath of fresh air, as often say, cutting through the lies in the social media and so forth. But this is a question of whether each and every individual recognizes that his personal role at this point in history is going to have an effect. In normal times, what they did may not have much effect. At a moment of crisis like this, what an individual does can change history for all of mankind. Now, let me just conclude by mentioning that there was that in terms of who is supporting this war on Russia and China, the trip of Biden here is meant to coerce the Asian nations to join in this anti-China Indo-Pacific and economic framework. Don't count on it. They'll get Japan and they'll get South Korea. But that's all. Who supports these sanctions on Russia? No one in the world other than the Five Eyes, the English-speaking people, the EU, who follows the dictates of the Five Eyes, and in Asia, South Korea and Japan, and Singapore. Singapore is sort of an exception to all of this. They're the one sort of they're a British banking outpost in Asia, you might say. But other than that, no one supports this. Not a single country in South America, not a single country in Africa. In Asia, only those three that I mentioned. The rest of the world is united against this lunacy. They prefer working with the New Belt and Road, with the idea of development, lifting people out of poverty rather than the war party in the West. So, I mean, this is the reality. And what we just saw in the Philippines, and this is important for people to note, they had an election last Tuesday, and in that election, Ferdinand Marcos, the son of the Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who was the president of the Philippines from, I think it was 72 until 1986, who was the most loved nationalist leader, not only in the Philippines, but across Asia, who lifted that country out of penury, out of poverty, who built the 11 industrial projects in steel and chemical and irrigation. He made the country self-sufficient in rice and corn for the first time in its history. He built the first nuclear power plant in Southeast Asia. And this man was overthrown by who? By George Shultz and Paul Wolfowitz, by one of the first regime change coups in 1986. People's power, they called it. Well, Marcos was at that time beloved by his people, except for the city-bound crowd that they mobilized into a mob to appear to be a popular revolt, people's power. But the vast majority of the country, which had been electrified and developed, and roads and power and schools and hospitals, loved him and his family and Imelda. And essentially his son Marcos ran without really campaigning very much. He held campaign rallies, but he ran on his father's legacy. And the fact that he remained loved, despite everything you read in the West about this vicious dictator hated by his people, a murderer, stole money, and blah, 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 all these lies. Same kind of lies you see now about Iraq, about Putin, and so forth. So this has now been proven. This guy won by a landslide, 2-1. There was probably enormous vote fraud, but it didn't work. His running mate, the daughter of Duterte, who's been the outgoing president, they formed basically a coalition. She won 3-1. This is an overwhelming vote. This would happen in virtually any country in the developing sector if they had leaders who represented this historic tradition of actual American system, sovereign rights, sovereign policy. So it demonstrates that we have the majority of the world's population on our side, on the side of reason, of ending these wars, of development rather than genocide and colonialism and racism and Malthusianism. But it means that we have to make sure that the U.S. doesn't, that the rest of the world doesn't try to form a bloc against the U.S. and Europe. Helga warns against this all the time, and rightfully so. It would just lead even more rapidly to a war. We have to get the U.S. and even the U.K. to break from this insanity and to sit down with Russia and China and India, not go to war with them, but to sit down with them in a new Peace of Westphalia, a new Bretton Woods, put together a new global financial system, put the dollar through bankruptcy so we can save the U.S. and Western economies. This is very difficult, but it's only at a moment in history like this in which everybody recognizes that nothing less than a total new paradigm, a new Peace of Westphalia, nothing less will stop this descent into a dark age. And yet this is the rare moment in history in which it's possible, precisely because everybody is forced to face the fact that humanity is being led over a cliff. So that's where we stand. I'll leave it at that.